September 1943. Darwin Harbor. 30 Italian women stepped off a cargo ship onto Australian soil, their bodies trembling, their minds racing with what they'd been told would happen next. They were nurses, evacuees, enemies of the state, and they had rehearsed the worst. They expected beatings, violations, public humiliation. One whispered to another, "They will make examples of us." But as guards led them north through the outback, something impossible happened. A young Australian private offered his jacket to a shivering woman. She was too terrified to take it. He simply draped it over the truck rail and walked away. At Tatura camp, they braced for the darkness. Instead, they received clean bunks, regular meals, no shackles, no assault. Just silence. That first night, one woman whispered, "Why aren't they hurting us?" No one had an answer, and the not knowing was more terrifying than knowing. But before we begin, if you want to hear more incredible, untold stories from history, hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. It's fascinating to see how far these stories travel. September 1943. Darwin Harbor smelled of salt and diesel and something else Teresa Marino couldn't name, the sharp tang of fear that clung to 30 women packed below deck for 3 weeks. She pressed her face against the cargo ship's porthole, watching the dock materialize through morning haze. Australian soldiers lined the pier, rifles slung across their backs, their faces hard and unreadable. Around them, the shouts of men unloading crates echoed across water that looked nothing like the Mediterranean. This water was green-gray, foreign, belonging to a continent Teresa had only seen on maps before her hospital ship went down. Beside her, Lucia Bianchi retched into a bucket for the 3rd time that morning. The girl was 19 but looked younger, her face hollow from weeks of rationed water and the kind of terror that aged you from the inside out. Teresa placed a hand on her back, feeling each vertebra through the torn fabric of what had once been a Red Cross uniform. Most of the women wore rags now, whatever they'd managed to grab when the torpedoes hit, when the sea opened up and swallowed everything they'd known. An older nurse had died 2 days into the voyage. Pneumonia, probably, though it could have been despair. Before she went, she'd gripped Teresa's wrist with surprising strength and whispered the phrases she'd heard from other prisoners, women who'd been captured before them. "They will violate us. They will parade us through the streets. They will make examples." Teresa had repeated those words to herself like a prayer, steeling herself for what was coming because knowing what to expect was better than the alternative. At least that's what she told herself. The ship's horn blasted. Teresa's stomach lurched. Around her, women crossed themselves, kissed rosaries, whispered too, saints who felt very far away. The cargo hold door screeched open and sunlight poured in, blinding after weeks in the dark. Australian voices barked orders Teresa couldn't understand. She'd learned enough English to count patients and request supplies, but this was different. Harsh syllables that felt like blows even before anyone touched them. They were herded up metal stairs, blinking against brightness that hurt. Teresa kept one hand on Lucia's shoulder, counting heads as they moved. 30 women. Still 30. She'd kept them all alive this long. On deck, the wind hit them, hot and dry, nothing like Italy's coastal breezes. It smelled of eucalyptus, a scent so foreign it made Teresa's chest tighten with homesickness for cypress and olive groves she might never see again. Down the gangway, onto the dock. Teresa's legs shook from disuse, from fear, from the weight of what she expected to happen next. The soldiers watched them pass. Some faces showed disgust. Some showed nothing at all. One young private couldn't have been more than 20, his eyes sliding away when Teresa looked at him directly, as if witnessing something he didn't want to see. They were loaded onto military trucks like cargo. Teresa climbed up last, making sure every woman was accounted for, then wedged herself near the tailgate where she could watch for whatever came next. The engine rumbled to life. Darwin fell away behind them, replaced by red dirt and scrub and a sky so blue it felt like drowning upward. Teresa waited for the blows, for hands that would grab and hurt, for the soldiers to show their true faces now that there were no witnesses, no officers, just 30 enemy women and miles of empty road. She rehearsed the phrases again in her mind. They will violate us. They will parade us. They will make examples. But the trucks just drove. An hour passed. Then 2. The sun climbed higher, brutal and unforgiving. Teresa's throat felt like sand. She watched the soldiers in the cab through the rear window, waiting for them to stop, to turn around with those hard faces, and a hand appeared through the gap between cab and bed. It held a canteen. Teresa stared at it. The hand shook the canteen, water sloshing inside. One of the soldiers, she couldn't see his face, was offering them water. Not throwing it, not making them beg, just offering. She didn't take it. It had to be a trick, a test. Take the water and they'd beat you for presumption, for thinking you deserved mercy. The hand waited, then withdrew. 10 minutes later, they stopped at a rest area. Nothing but a few trees and a wooden outhouse. The soldiers climbed out, lit cigarettes, stretched their legs. The young private Teresa had noticed on the dock walked to the back of the truck. In his hands, he held a jacket. He looked at Lucia, who was shivering despite the heat, shock doing strange things to the body. He said something in English, his voice soft. Lucia pressed herself against Teresa, terrified. The private didn't push, didn't reach for her. He simply draped the jacket over the truck's side rail within reach, then walked away to join the others. Lucia stared at the jacket like it might bite. Teresa leaned close, her lips brushing Lucia's ear. "A trick," she whispered, "to make us soft before they—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. They both knew what came next. What always came next for women who became prisoners, who became property, who stopped being human in the eyes of men with power. The trucks drove on. The sun began its descent. When they finally arrived at Tatura Camp, dusk was settling over endless flat land that looked nothing like home. Through the truck's slats, Teresa saw it. Rows of wooden huts, guard towers rising like sentries, floodlights already buzzing to life, and wire. So much wire strung between posts, separating the world into inside and outside, free and captive. Her stomach dropped. This was where it would happen, where the restraint would end and the real punishment would begin. She'd heard the stories. Everyone had. Prison camps were where men did things they could later deny, where women disappeared into guard huts and came back changed or didn't come back at all. But as they were led through the gates, something impossible caught her eye. Male Italian prisoners of war worked in a vegetable garden plot, their hands in soil, their movements unhurried. One looked up, saw the women, and his face split into shock and joy. "Sorel," he shouted. "Sisters, you're alive!" Teresa waited for the rifle butt to his skull, for the guard to show them what happened when you spoke without permission. But the guard just kept walking, his rifle still slung across his back as if a prisoner's joy was too small a thing to punish. They were taken to a separate compound. Clean barracks, thin mattresses that still felt like luxury after the ship. A wash house with actual running water. No shackles on the walls, no blood stains on the floors. Just silence and the smell of eucalyptus and the terrible, crushing weight of not understanding. That first night, Teresa lay on her bunk, every muscle tensed, listening for boots in the dark, for doors opening, for the moment when the mask would slip and the real Australia would show its face. Around her, women wept quietly or prayed or lay as still as corpses, waiting. Lucia's whisper cut through the darkness. "Why aren't they—" She couldn't finish either. Teresa had no answer. She'd prepared for cruelty. She'd steeled herself for violation. She'd made peace with death. But this absence of violence, this strange mercy that felt like its own kind of torture, she had no defense against this. The not knowing was worse than knowing, because hope was the most dangerous thing a prisoner could carry, and Teresa could feel it trying to take root in her chest, like something that would only hurt more when they finally ripped it out. The first week at Tatura unfolded in a rhythm Teresa didn't trust. Dawn brought roll call, names read from clipboards by guards who didn't meet their eyes but didn't spit at them either. Then work detail, except it wasn't forced labor. It was voluntary. Paid in camp script they could use at the canteen for soap or writing paper or extra food. The work itself, laundry, kitchen duty, mending uniforms, felt almost normal, like they were employees rather than prisoners, and that normalcy unsettled Teresa more than cruelty would have. The meals arrived 3 times a day. Plain food, nothing fancy but regular. Protein, vegetables, bread that wasn't sawdust, more than they'd had under Mussolini's rationing back home, more than they'd seen in months. Teresa watched other women eat and couldn't shake the feeling that this abundance was fattening them for some purpose they hadn't yet revealed. She mapped every guard's routine, memorized which ones smoked at which posts, timed the searchlight rotations, waiting for the trap to spring. Sergeant Margaret Flynn conducted inspections with military precision. She was tall, angular, with a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile years ago. She never spoke beyond orders, never offered anything resembling kindness. But Teresa noticed things. How Maggie ensured the women's compound received Red Cross parcels before the men's. How when a shipment of sanitary supplies arrived, embarrassing, necessary things, Maggie didn't make a ceremony of it. Just left boxes in the wash house without comment, without forcing anyone to ask or beg or explain. Teresa watched Maggie the way she'd watched surgeons during operations, looking for the tells that revealed what someone would do under pressure. But Maggie gave nothing away. She was all uniform and regulations and a spine so straight it looked painful. The other guards called her Sergeant Flynn, or just Flynn, never Maggie, and they jumped when she spoke. Whatever warmth she'd once possessed had been burned out of her, leaving only duty and distance. The eucalyptus smell became constant. It drifted through the wire on hot winds that felt foreign against Teresa's skin, nothing like Mediterranean breezes. At night, she'd lie awake smelling it and feeling the wrongness of being alive in a place that should have been her grave. The other women started to relax, started to laugh occasionally during work detail, started to accept that maybe the Australians really weren't going to hurt them. But Teresa couldn't let go. She'd seen too many patients die just when they thought they'd survive. Private James Cooper started appearing during yard time. He was young, maybe 22, with a farmer's build and a limp from some injury that kept him from the front. He'd lean against the fence, not the guard tower, just the fence, like he was keeping them company rather than keeping them contained. He started talking to Lucia, whose fear had locked her voice away so completely she barely whispered even to Teresa. At first, Teresa thought it was predatory. Men didn't talk to young women in prison camps for innocent reasons. She positioned herself between them, ready to intervene. But Cooper just pointed at things and said English words slowly. Water, bread, thank you, please, sky, bird, friend. Lucia listened with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that might save her life. She repeated the words in whispers that grew slightly less terrified each day. Teresa watched Cooper for signs of ulterior motives. For the moment, his kindness would curdle into demands, but he just taught words and smiled when Lucia got them right and never touched her, never even moved closer to the fence than regulation allowed. He had sad eyes, Teresa noticed, the kind of sadness that came from losing someone, not from being cruel. Still, she didn't trust him. Trust was a luxury prisoners couldn't afford. Then one evening in late September, a delivery truck brought newspapers to the guard's station. Teresa was walking past carrying laundry back to the barracks when a headline caught her eye through the open door. The words were in English, but big enough and simple enough that she could read them. Italy surrenders, switches sides. She dropped the laundry basket. Her hands found Maggie's arm before her brain could stop them, grabbing the sergeant's uniform sleeve with desperate fingers. Is it true? The English came out broken, urgent. We're not enemies anymore? Maggie's jaw went tight, her eyes pale blue, ice cold, fixed on Teresa's face. You were still enemies when my brother died. The words came out flat, factual, but underneath them Teresa heard something else. Grief, the kind that never healed, just scabbed over. Teresa released her arm like it had burned her. For a moment they stood there, two women on opposite sides of wire that was suddenly less clear than it had been. Teresa's voice came out sharper than she'd intended. "I was stitching soldiers back together so they could go home to their mothers. What were you doing?" The silence stretched between them like the distance between continents. Other guards glanced over, sensing confrontation. Teresa waited for punishment, for the report that would mean isolation, reduced rations, whatever consequences came from touching an officer, from speaking back, from being human instead of obedient. Maggie's face didn't change. "My job." She picked up the laundry basket, handed it back to Teresa, and walked away. Her shoulders stayed straight, her pace even, giving nothing away. That night, Teresa lay awake, expecting retribution, expecting to be called to Maggie's office, to face whatever punishment came from crossing lines prisoners weren't supposed to cross. But nothing happened. No report, no discipline, just silence. What Teresa didn't know, couldn't know, was that Maggie sat in her small office until the candle burned down to nothing, staring at a photograph of a young man in uniform. Tommy Flynn, 21 years old forever, his smile bright and reckless in a way Maggie had never managed. The photograph sat on her desk next to a stack of forms she was supposed to file, forms that included an incident report for unauthorized physical contact with camp personnel. Maggie picked up her pen 3 times. Put it down 3 times. The Italian woman, Teresa Marino, according to the files, had grabbed her, had questioned her, had looked at her with eyes that demanded to be seen as human, as equal, as someone with the right to know if the war that had destroyed her life had finally shifted. Maggie's brother had died at Tobruk. Italian artillery. She'd memorized the details from the letter his commanding officer sent, had read it so many times the paper had worn soft. Tommy had been trying to help a wounded mate when the shells came. He'd died doing something brave and good, and that somehow made it worse. The Italian women in her camp hadn't fired those shells. Maggie knew that, knew it the way she knew dozens of regulations and procedures and protocols that made up her days. But knowing something and feeling it were different countries, and grief didn't care about logic. She looked at the blank incident report, looked at Tommy's photograph, thought about her mother back in Melbourne, alone and fading, sending letters that Maggie answered with reassurances that felt like lies. Thought about the Italian nurse who'd grabbed her arm, not with violence but with desperate hope, who'd challenged her not with cruelty but with the simple question of what she'd been doing while other people stitched the dying back together. Maggie filed the incident report in the bottom drawer, blank. She blew out the candle. In the darkness, she whispered to her brother's memory, "I don't know what you'd want me to do." But Tommy had been dead 3 years, and the only answer was silence and the smell of eucalyptus through the window and the weight of choosing mercy when vengeance would be so much simpler. Months passed like water finding its level. By autumn of 1944, Tatra had transformed from a place Teresa endured into something she couldn't quite name. The camp's rhythm had become familiar. The morning roll call, the work details that felt less like punishment and more like purpose. The evenings when women gathered in the yard to talk about home in voices that had forgotten how to whisper in constant fear. Italy's status had shifted, no longer enemy but co-belligerent, though what that meant for their future remained unclear. The women were reclassified as protected persons, a bureaucratic term that sounded better than prisoner of war, but offered no promise of when they'd see home again. Teresa watched the changing leaves on trees that weren't Italian and wondered if this in-between state, not quite enemy, not quite free, was worse than certainty. But something had shifted in her, too. She'd started teaching basic Italian to the guards' children during weekend family visits. They came on Sundays, these Australian children with sun-bleached hair and gap-toothed smiles, fascinated by the foreign women behind the wire. Their parents watched nervously at first, but Teresa taught them counting games and simple songs, and the children laughed like children everywhere, unburdened by the hatreds their parents carried. Maggie had approved the lessons with a terse notation about cultural exchange, improving camp relations. She never smiled during the Sunday sessions, never commented beyond logistics, but Teresa caught her watching sometimes from across the yard, her face unreadable but her attention focused. They still didn't speak beyond what duty required. The conversation about Italy's surrender had created a careful distance neither knew how to cross. But something had softened in the space between them. Not quite friendship, not quite trust. Just the beginning of recognition. Lucia had transformed most visibly. She'd claimed a small plot in the vegetable garden the camp administration allowed, digging in Australian soil with hands that remembered her father's shop, the garden behind it where tomatoes grew wild and basil perfumed summer evenings. She planted seeds hoarded from kitchen scraps, tomato, basil, even a struggling oregano plant that probably wouldn't survive the climate, but tried anyway. Things that tasted like home, that made the foreign air smell less foreign. Private Cooper helped her sometimes during his off-duty hours, showing her which plants thrived in this soil, teaching her the English names for growing things. Lucia's voice had returned in fragments, single words at first, then short sentences practiced with Cooper's patient encouragement. She smiled occasionally now, small expressions that felt like miracles after months of silence. Teresa watched them together and had stopped seeing predation. She saw instead two young people who'd both lost something teaching each other how to speak again. Maggie cited morale and nutrition when approving the garden expansion. She wrote it in reports that went to officers who probably never read them, justifying kindness in the language of regulations because that was the only language the system understood. But Teresa had learned to read between Maggie's bureaucratic lines to see the humanity she hid behind procedure. Then in late November, a Red Cross official arrived with news that split the air like thunder. They could write letters home, real letters, uncensored, routed through Vatican channels that had finally opened after months of negotiation. The announcement came during morning assembly, delivered in English first, then translated, and the women's response was instantaneous. Tears, embraces, the kind of joy that hurt because it carried months of silence, months of not knowing if anyone they loved was still alive. Teresa wrote to her sister Anna in Naples. She sat in the barracks with paper and pencil, both provided by the BEM camp, and tried to capture what had happened to her. "I thought I would die here," she wrote in Italian that felt rusty after months of speaking broken English. "Instead, I found something I cannot name. They do not hate us. They do not hurt us. I do not understand mercy, but I think I am looking at it." She told Anna about Lucia's garden, about Cooper's English lessons, about Maggie's cold efficiency that somehow protected them more than warmth ever could. She ended with, "Come home to me when this is over. I want to show you what survived." Maggie collected the letters as required by protocol. She was supposed to scan them for security risks, for coded messages or intelligence that might compromise operations. Instead, she found herself reading Teresa's letter to her sister, found herself crying in her office for the first time since Tommy's death. The Italian nurse's words, "I do not understand mercy, but I think I am looking at it," broke something in Maggie's carefully maintained defenses. She sealed the letter with shaking hands and sent it on, knowing it violated every rule about emotional distance she'd built to survive this war. Christmas Eve, 1944 arrived cold and clear. The women had been hoarding rations for weeks, saving sugar and flour and dried fruit, determined to make panettone even in a prison camp on the other side of the world. The kitchen smelled like home for the first time in over a year, yeast and citrus and the particular sweetness of dough rising despite everything. Maggie appeared that evening carrying something Teresa hadn't expected, a gramophone, old and battered, with a crack in the horn, but functional. "My brothers," Maggie said, the first personal thing she'd ever shared. She set it up in the common room without ceremony, without explanation beyond those two words that carried the weight of a life ended. She played carols, Australian versions, unfamiliar melodies that still carried Christmas in their bones. Private Cooper taught them waltzing Matilda, patient with pronunciation, laughing when they tangled English vowels into Italian shapes. In return, the women taught him Tu scendi dalla stella, the lullaby every Italian child knew, and Cooper's voice cracked on the chorus in a way that suggested he'd lost more than he'd ever said. For one night, the war existed only in memory. The wire was still there, the guards still kept watch, but inside the common room something else happened. Not forgetting, not pretending, just a moment of shared humanity that refused to be extinguished by everything that tried to kill it. Lucia smiled. Not the small, careful expression she'd been practicing, but a full, genuine smile that lit her whole face and made her look 19 again instead of ancient. Teresa felt something in her chest unclench, the constant vigilance that had kept her alive finally loosening enough to let hope breathe. And Maggie. Maggie looked at these Italian women eating panettone and singing off-key Christmas carols and realized she'd stopped seeing prisoners weeks ago, maybe months. She saw women, just women, who'd survived as much as she had and somehow kept their capacity for joy. Then New Year came, and with it the mail that shattered everything they'd carefully built. The telegram arrived for Maggie first. Her mother had died. Pneumonia, the official cause, but Maggie knew better. Loneliness, grief, the slow death of watching everyone you loved march into wars they didn't come home from. Catherine Flynn had died alone in Melbourne while her daughter was 1,200 miles away managing a prison camp, choosing duty over the woman who'd raised her. The guilt hit Maggie like shrapnel, sharp and deep and impossible to remove. The same mail delivery brought letters for the Italian women. Teresa's came in Anna's handwriting on the envelope, but the letter inside was from a neighbor. "Your sister is dead. Allied bombing, January 4th. She was teaching children in a shelter when it collapsed. I am sorry." The words were brief, factual, the way death got recorded when there were too many deaths to properly mourn. Lucia's letter came from an aunt she barely knew. "Your father was executed by partisans in October. They said he was a collaborator, that he sold food to Germans. He was just trying to feed his family. Your mother is in a camp near Turin. I don't know more." The aunt's handwriting was shaky, old, carrying its own weight of loss. Teresa read her letter 3 times before the meaning penetrated. Anna was dead, killed by Allied bombs, killed by the same forces that now treated Teresa with unexpected mercy, that gave her paper to write letters and let her teach children Italian songs. The irony was unbearable. She'd survived Australian imprisonment while her sister died from Australian allies. The world had inverted and nothing made sense anymore. She looked across the yard and saw Maggie standing alone, reading her telegram, her face carved from stone. Their eyes met. 2 women who'd lost everything to the same war, standing on opposite sides of wire that suddenly felt insurmountable again. Maggie turned away first, walking toward her office with steps that looked like they hurt. For 3 days, they didn't speak. Maggie walked past Teresa during inspections without acknowledgement, her face empty of everything except duty. Teresa stopped teaching the children, stopped going to the common room, stopped pretending that mercy meant anything when it came from the same hands that killed your family. Lucia stopped tending her garden. The tomatoes withered in the summer heat, and no one cared enough to water them. The space between them became a chasm, and neither knew how to cross it, or if crossing it was even possible anymore. The grief settled over Tatura like ash, coating everything in gray. January 1945 crawled forward with the weight of all they'd lost, pressing down on days that felt too hot, too bright, too relentlessly alive when the people they loved were dead. Teresa moved through her routines mechanically. Roll call, work detail, meals she barely tasted, her body functioning while her mind stayed trapped in a Naples bomb shelter, watching her sister die over and over in ways she'd never witnessed but couldn't stop imagining. Anna had been teaching children when the building collapsed. That detail haunted Teresa most. Her sister had spent her last moments doing exactly what she'd always done, creating small pockets of normalcy in a world gone mad, giving children something to hold on to when everything else was falling apart. And Allied bombers had killed her. The same allies whose prison camp fed Teresa 3 meals a day and let her plant gardens and teach songs. The contradiction was a knife that kept twisting. Maggie had disappeared into her office and regulations. She emerged only for inspections, her face so carefully blank it looked painted on. She spoke in monosyllables, approved requests with signatures that looked angry, and worked through nights until the other guards whispered concerns she couldn't hear or wouldn't acknowledge. Her mother had died alone. That fact circled Maggie's mind like a vulture, picking at the choice she'd made to serve instead of stay, to manage prisoners instead of holding her mother's hand at the end. The camp felt the shift. Guards became stricter, enforcing rules they'd let slide during the Christmas warmth. The Italian women withdrew into clusters of shared grief, speaking less, smiling never. Even Private Cooper stopped his English lessons with Lucia, sensing that something had broken that his gentle teaching couldn't fix. The wire between compounds became a real barrier again, separating not just prisoners from guards, but the living from the dead, the lucky from the destroyed. Corporal Davies had been watching. He was older than the other guards, maybe 43, with a face carved by loss into something hard and unforgiving. He'd served in North Africa, had watched his son die at Bardia during an Italian counterattack, and he'd never forgiven himself for surviving when his boy didn't. The Christmas celebration had disgusted him, watching Flynn play her dead brother's music for enemy women, watching them all pretend that being human together meant anything when good men were still dying. But now something had shifted. Flynn was grief-hollowed, barely functional. The Italian women were mourning losses from Allied actions, and Davies saw his opportunity to restore what he believed was proper order, the kind where enemies stayed enemies and mercy didn't confuse things. He started small, extra inspections of the women's barracks, looking for contraband that didn't exist, stricter enforcement of yard time, cutting it short for minor infractions, longer roll calls in the summer heat, making them stand while he slowly checked names. Nothing technically outside regulations, but everything, designed to remind them they were prisoners, not guests. Not women deserving gentleness. Teresa noticed. She'd been watching guards since Darwin Harbor, mapping their cruelties before they happened. Davies was different from the others. Older, harder, carrying a rage that had been simmering since before they arrived. She saw how he looked at them, saw the contempt mixed with something worse. Pain. The kind of pain that needed somewhere to go, and they were convenient targets. She tried to warn the others to stay invisible, to give Davies no excuse. But grief made people careless. One afternoon in late January, Lucia was in the garden. Anna's death had driven her back to the soil, the only place that still made sense, when Davies walked past on patrol. She was crying quietly, pulling weeds from around tomato plants that had somehow survived the neglect, and she didn't hear him approach. Davies stopped, watched her. His son had loved gardens too, had talked about the farm they'd run together after the war, before Italian artillery turned those dreams to meat and memory. "Get up," he said, his voice flat. "Yard time's over." Lucia looked up, confused. It wasn't over. She could see other women still outside. Her English had improved, but fear made it disappear. She said something in Italian, an apology or explanation, and reached for the shovel to put it away. Davies saw the shovel, saw an enemy woman reaching for a weapon. Or maybe he just saw an excuse he'd been waiting months to take. His hand moved to his rifle, unslung it from his shoulder with the smooth motion of long practice. "I said get up." Teresa was crossing the yard when she heard his tone, recognized the shift from order to threat. She ran without thinking, putting herself between Davies and Lucia, her hands raised in the universal gesture of surrender. "Please," she said in English, the word coming out desperate. "She doesn't understand. Please." Davies's rifle came up, not pointed at the ground anymore, but level, aimed at Teresa's chest. His finger rested on the trigger guard. Not on the trigger itself, not yet, but close enough that everyone in the yard froze. Close enough that the other guards turned, saw what was happening, and didn't immediately intervene because Davies was senior, was combat-tested, was within his rights to maintain order by whatever means necessary. "She reached for a weapon," Davies said, his voice steady, reasonable, the voice of a man explaining why he had no choice. "You're interfering with security operations." Teresa's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The moment she'd been waiting for since Darwin Harbor, the moment when the mask fell away and Australia showed its true face. She'd been right to never trust the kindness, right to keep watching for the trap. It had just taken longer to spring than she'd expected. But then Maggie's voice cut across the yard, sharp as broken glass. "Stand down, Corporal." Davies didn't lower the knee rifle. "Sergeant, this prisoner was—" "I said stand down." Maggie walked toward them, her stride eating ground, her face still blank, but her eyes alive with something Teresa couldn't read. Not quite anger, something colder and more dangerous. "Put the weapon down. Now." The yard held its breath. Every prisoner, every guard, everyone watched as Davies made his choice. He was senior in years and combat experience. Maggie outranked him by grade, but he'd seen things she hadn't, had earned his bitterness in blood while she'd earned her stripes pushing papers. He could make a case that she'd gone soft, that her grief had broken her judgment, that someone needed to restore proper discipline. His finger moved closer to the trigger, just a fraction. Just enough that Maggie saw and knew that rules and regulations wouldn't be enough, that she'd have to choose between the safety of a woman who'd once grabbed her arm and demanded to be seen as human, or the path of least resistance that let men like Davies define what mercy looked like in wartime. Maggie's hand moved to her own sidearm. She didn't draw it. Didn't need to. Just rested her palm on the holster in a gesture every person there understood. "I will ask you one more time, Corporal Davies. Stand. Down." Something in her voice, some core of steel that came from watching her brother die to Italian artillery and choosing not to let that death define every choice after, made Davies finally lower the rifle. He slung it back over his shoulder with movements that looked violent even in surrender. His face was red, his jaw working like he was chewing words too dangerous to spit out. "You're going soft, Sergeant," he said, quiet enough that maybe only Maggie and Teresa heard. "They killed your brother. They're killing boys right now in Italy, and you're protecting them like they're worth protecting." Maggie's expression didn't change. "Return to your post. We'll discuss this in my office." Davies walked away, his shoulders rigid with the rage of a man who'd been denied the violence he'd been building toward for months. The yard slowly exhaled, movement returning in careful increments. Lucia sobbed into Teresa's shoulder, her whole body shaking. The other women clustered close, protective, knowing how narrow the margin had been. Maggie looked at Teresa for a long moment. Their eyes met across 3 feet of space that felt like the distance between stars. Neither spoke. There was too much to say and no words that could carry the weight of what had just happened. The choice Maggie had made, the protection she'd offered, the line she'd drawn that said some things mattered more than grief, more than revenge, more than the easy comfort of hatred. Then Maggie turned and followed Davies toward the administration building, her back straight, her pace even, carrying the weight of a decision that would define everything that came after. That evening, Teresa found Maggie sitting alone behind the administration building in a patch of dirt that barely qualified as a garden. The sergeant had her back against the weathered wood, her knees drawn up in a posture that looked nothing like military bearing. She was smoking a cigarette with the desperate focus of someone trying to burn through more than tobacco. Tommy's photograph lay face up in the dust beside her, and in the fading light Teresa could see the young man's smile, reckless and bright, everything his sister wasn't. Teresa should have walked away, should have returned to the barracks where the other women were still comforting Lucia, still processing how close they'd come to violence after months of strange safety. But something pulled her forward, some thread that had been stretching between them since that first confrontation about Italy's surrender. Since Christmas Eve, when Maggie had brought her brother's gramophone, since Davies's rifle had pointed at Teresa's chest, and Maggie had chosen a side that cost her something. She sat down without asking permission, leaving a careful distance between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. The eucalyptus smell was stronger here, mixing with cigarette smoke and the particular scent of Australian summer, dry grass and red earth and heat that didn't fade even after sunset. "He wanted to be a pilot," Maggie said finally, her voice rough. She was looking at Tommy's photograph, not at Teresa. "Lied about his age to enlist. 17. They found out, but by then he'd finished basic training and they needed bodies more than they needed rules." She took a drag, exhaled slowly. "He wrote me letters about the desert. Made it sound like an adventure. Never mentioned being scared, not once. I think he thought if he admitted fear, I'd worry more. Teresa listened. She'd learned in triage that sometimes people needed to speak into silence, needed someone to witness their grief without trying to fix it. He died at Tobruk, November 1941, Italian artillery. Maggie's voice stayed flat, factual, like she was reading from a report. His commanding officer wrote that Tommy was helping a wounded mate when the shells came, that he died doing something brave. She laughed, but it sounded like breaking. That's supposed to make it better. That he died well. Like there's a good way to be blown apart at 21. Teresa's throat closed. She thought of Anna, crushed under rubble while teaching children their letters. Of Lucha's father, executed for the crime of trying to survive. Of all the good deaths that were still just death, still just people stolen from the world before their time. My sister was a teacher, Teresa said quietly. She believed education could survive anything. Spent the war in bomb shelters teaching children, giving them something besides fear to hold on to. She picked up a handful of red dirt, let it sift through her fingers. Allied bombs killed her. January. Same planes that probably belong to pilots who guard us. Here. Who bring us food? Who don't hurt us? Maggie turned to look at her then. Really look at her, not through her or around her, but directly into her eyes. How do you live with that? How do you sit here talking to me when my side killed your sister? How do you protect us when my side killed your brother? Teresa asked back. The question hung between them like smoke. Maggie stubbed out her cigarette in the dirt, immediately reached for another, changed her mind. Her hands shook slightly. Davies thinks I've gone soft. Maybe I have. Maybe grief broke something in me that was supposed to stay hard. She pulled her knees tighter to her chest, suddenly looking younger, more vulnerable. My mother died thinking I chose duty over her. Maybe I did. I don't know anymore what the right choices look like. I don't think anyone does, Teresa said. I think we're all just trying to survive without becoming the kind of people we'd be ashamed to be. Maggie was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. When Davies raised that rifle today, I saw Tommy. Not you, not Lucia, just my brother at 17, lying about his age because he thought war was glorious, because he thought dying for something made the dying meaningful. She wiped her eyes roughly, angry at the tears. And I thought, if Tommy were here, what would he want me to do? And I knew he'd want me to lower the gun, to choose the living over the dead, even if it cost me, even if it meant protecting the people who killed him. Teresa felt something crack in her chest, the armor she'd been wearing since Darwin Harbor finally breaking. Anna would want the same. She'd want me to keep teaching children, to keep seeing people as people even when it hurts, even when it feels like betrayal. She looked up at the stars starting to emerge, constellations she didn't know in a sky that wasn't hers. I hated you at first. Prepared for you to hurt us. Couldn't understand why you didn't. I wanted to, Maggie admitted. God help me, I wanted to. It would have been easier than this. Easier than seeing you as human, than having to choose mercy every single day when revenge would feel so much simpler. She picked up Tommy's photograph, traced his face with one finger. But he was soft-hearted under all that bravado. Used to bring home injured animals, cry when they died. He'd be so disappointed if I let his death make me cruel. Anna would say the same about me, Teresa said. She found beauty in rubble, made gardens in bomb craters. If she could keep believing in goodness during all that, how can I give up on it now? They sat together as the sky darkened, two women from opposite sides of a war that had taken everything from them, finding in each other the only thing that made sense anymore, the stubborn, painful choice to remain human when being human cost too much. They didn't become friends in that moment. Friendship required too much history they didn't share. But they became something else, witnesses to each other's grief, proof that mercy wasn't weakness but the hardest kind of strength. Inside the administration building, Davies packed his belongings. Maggie had given him a choice in her office, transfer, or face formal charges for threatening a prisoner without cause. He'd chosen transfer, heading to a combat posting in the Pacific where enemies stayed enemies and nobody confused restraint with honor. Before he left, he'd said, "You're making a mistake, Flynn. Showing them kindness won't bring your brother back." Maggie had looked at him with something like pity. "No, but maybe it means his death doesn't make the world crueler than it already is." Now, sitting in the dirt with an Italian nurse whose sister her allies had killed, Maggie understood what she'd really meant. The world was going to keep taking people they loved. The war was going to keep grinding through lives like meat through a grinder. They couldn't stop that, but they could choose what they did with their grief, whether they let it harden into hatred or soften into something that looked like understanding. Teresa stood first, brushed red dirt from her uniform. "Thank you," she said simply, "for today, for choosing us when you had every reason not to." Maggie stood too, her military bearing returning in increments. "Don't thank me yet. We still have months of this, maybe years, and I can't promise every day will be safe." "I know," Teresa said, "but now I know something else too, that some people keep their promises even when it costs them. That mercy is real, even here. Even now." She paused, then added, "Anna would have liked you. She always said the best people were the ones who chose kindness when they had permission to be cruel." Maggie's eyes filled, but she didn't let the tears fall. "Tommy would have liked your sister. He always wanted to teach kids about flying." She picked up his photograph, held it against her chest. "Maybe that's what we owe them. To be the kind of people they believed we could be, even after they're gone." Teresa nodded. They walked back toward the main compound together, not quite side by side, but no longer on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide. Above them, the Southern Cross blazed in a sky that belonged to no one nation, that watched all of them, the living and the dead, the cruel and the kind, the ones who chose vengeance and the ones who chose something harder. In the barracks, Lucia was teaching another woman the English words Private Cooper had taught her. Water, bread, thank you, please, hope. The words felt fragile in the wake of Davies's rifle, but they were being spoken anyway, passed from mouth to mouth like prayers or promises, like the insistence that they would survive not just with their bodies, but with their humanity intact. And in the dark, Teresa let herself believe it. Let herself imagine that when this was over, when the wire came down and they could finally go home to whatever home still existed, they would carry this with them. Proof that even in the worst circumstances, even when grief demanded cruelty, some people chose differently. Some people looked at their enemies and decided to see them anyway. It wouldn't erase the losses, wouldn't bring back Anna or Tommy or Lucia's father or any of the thousands dead, but it meant their deaths hadn't made the survivors into monsters. And maybe in a world that kept trying to turn people into monsters, that was the only victory that mattered.